Good afternoon. The ARC, the Attachment Research Community, has a mission that all schools should be attachment and trauma aware by 2025. And what we're going to do in this presentation is try and give you an explanation of why we have that mission and where that came from and what we're doing about it and what we intend to do next. And it's really nice to be here and to be working with the Rees Simpson project, who we see is very much part of that vision. So there are three big drivers behind what we're doing. One is the recognition that a lot of children in our schools have got adverse childhood experiences, unmet attachment needs and trauma, and that affects them profoundly. We also know that school leaders are challenged about what to do about mental health and well-being, and our proposition is that those can be addressed through becoming an attachment and trauma aware school or setting. And finally, we recognise the importance of research in helping us to understand what works and why.
And the evidence is that in every classroom, at least a third of children have some sort of insecure attachment with at least one caregiver. Some studies have suggested that as many as 80% of children diagnosed with ADHD have attachment issues. 98% of children surveyed in 2004 had one or more traumatic events, and for 1 in 4, this resulted in behavioural disturbance. And a smaller study demonstrated that in a top set Year 8 class in a social housing area, 7 out of 29 pupils were in care or in some form of support plan. And the latest DFE guidance on mental health and behaviour is saying very clearly that schools have an important role to play in supporting mental health and wellbeing of children by developing whole school approaches, as well as considering the needs of individual pupils.
So if we want to get to the holy grail, if you like, of resilience, we can't bypass attachment and trauma. And this is certainly what the Harvard Centre on the Developing Child is saying. The importance, if you want resilience to be there, of building a strong relationally based approach to working with young people in school. These are big challenges. ARC is trying to meet those challenges and support schools and settings to do so. And when it works, we see big differences for children.
And indeed, a project we've been running since 2012 with Barton LT Somerset, we wanted to look at the impact of understanding behaviour problems, which started in reception, but we then launched it across all schools, following a programme of training and consultancy. And this is just a quote from one of the heads. It took a series of children with needs we just found hard to identify till we started to apply attachment theory thinking. It just unlocked those children and made us able to understand what was going on with greater clarity. As a result, we got to make much more progress with them.
It's really good to see that this kind of excellent practice is being understood and recognised. For example, in Ofsted inspections, Hope School in Liverpool, who have been working with us on our model, have very recently had the outstanding Ofsted report that you can see, and the recognition that it was a good thing to move from what was already a very successful school to a school that was attachment and trauma aware, and the impact. And it's nice to see that that school is able both to address the behavioural needs of the children, their underlying mental health, but also enable them to make outstanding progress. Putting those things together, we know, is very, very important.
And our work sort of began with some work we were doing with a group of care leaders, which we took out to schools, and we got 2 responses. One was the, okay, we get it, but please help us do something about it. And the other was, well, what about the other 29? So we began to understand what we needed was a strategic and a practical approach, but also an approach that was universal rather than just targeted at 1 or 2 specific groups. Our work in Baines with the reception classes showed that there's a need for sustainability. External consultants are very expensive. One-off CPD, there's all sorts of questions as to how effective that is. So we needed to have something that's cost effective, so that we could measure what matters and we could sustain our workforce in developing that. And the model we came to was this. And you'll see it looks like a triangle, 2D, but 3D is actually a pyramid, because in any school, any setting, there's a small group of children who actually require additional specialist support, and we shouldn't shy away from that. On the other hand, at the base of that pyramid, everyone, if a school is emotionally aware and attachment aware is going to benefit. And that includes the staff, parents and the whole school community. In the middle, you have a group of children with unmet attachment needs. Some days they'll be fine, other days they'll be hell on wheels. And what we need to look at is how schools can operate to provide targeted support, but also that referral where it's needed.
So this is where we are now, and I've skipped through 3 slides which you can read, but where we got to with the ARC with this understanding was that we needed to create something in the middle for schools and settings that were wrestling with these big and challenging issues around ACEs, attachment, trauma, something where practitioners could talk to each other, share good practice and celebrate what was working. And part of what ARC is doing is to create that community. Partly, we are also providing schools with advice about how best to implement an attachment-aware approach. We know there are lots of pitfalls on the journey. One-off events don't seem to work. Having just one person on the whole staff team understanding the needs of individual children tends to overload that one person whilst leaving everybody else somewhat isolated or in ignorance. So our approach is a whole school pathway going through an audit, development plan, commissioning training for that development plan and setting up a project, so measuring the impact on the school. We're also wanting to build a platform where schools can share their action research. We have a national conference, we have regional workshops, and we also have awards. We're very keen that we celebrate the best stuff, that schools recognise the big difference that they make. So our objectives are to support schools to become attachment aware, to enhance existing and potential collaborative communities of support, to collate and provide a national platform for research and practice, to help provide and extend a national voice for attachment and trauma, and to recognise, celebrate and share best practice.
And we thought we'd give you a taste of conference. Our last conference was the 21st of November, the sort of range of speakers that we have involved, the range of workshops, and just reflecting on the support we get in perhaps some unlikely places. Not many people know this, but if you go into any Simpson shoe shop, you will find there's a little stack of booklets written by John Simpson himself, which covers areas such as attachment, looking after children in care, and so lifelong support for people. John Simpson is a complete believer in and devotee to attachment approaches. They've actually fostered over 90 children in his time. And just some of his comments on the 21st of November. He's talking about a whole school approach led by an inspirational head, saying to schools, run schools the way you think they should be run, not for Ofsted or league tables. Leave it to the teachers to do what they think works best, and let every individual child have the opportunity to work to the best of their abilities. Show it works, do it well, and make a difference.
And we were really pleased to have this year the biggest number of applications for the Alex Simpson ARC Awards, which are looking at schools that are innovating, that are making a difference to the whole school community, and sometimes actually working collaboratively with a whole group of schools to implement best practice. You can see our finalists there, and you can see our winners. And you can find the PowerPoints and the films that these winners submitted on our website. But just to give you a bit of a flavour, here they are. Lots of different schools doing very interesting, quite individual things to meet the needs of their communities. It's not too late to win an award for your best practice. This is what we are doing for 2020. So if you'd like to find out more, you can pick up a pack from us. You need to work with your virtual head because we're keen to support the work of virtual heads. They can nominate your school or setting for one of our 5 categories. And those schools and settings can then go on, if they're shortlisted, produce a PowerPoint or a film to capture their practice. They come to our conference, and the winners this year have received £1,000, and also the request that they share what they're doing through a regional workshop. We know it's really important for practitioners to be talking to each other and sharing what they're doing.
And Tony, we mentioned later the sort of support you can get by working with ARC. One important area which we're growing is our regional workshops. but also now we're developing special focus conferences. So this one that we're holding on the 10th of March actually came originally from a regional workshop, and the concerns around gangs, violence, and what could attachment teach us, what can attachment help us with in that area. So we think that's going to be a really interesting conference. Our next major conference is the 24th of November. Again, we've listened to the sort of evidence that's coming through the work that the Rees Centre is doing, through the work we're doing at Bath Spa and other colleagues up and down the country, which are all pointing, we feel, in the same direction. It's the leadership that is really important in actually making sure schools and settings become attachment and trauma aware. So that's why we've got that focus, and we're working on that for next time.
So Dr. Neil Harrison will be presenting the interim findings of the Rees Simpson research at that conference. And part of that is going to be about what's working strategically in implementing an attachment trauma approach. And we're keen actually to try and get that as clear and as transparent for schools as possible. So if you go back to our original question where schools say, I get it, now what do I do? Our ambition is to be able to answer that and say, well, here's a whole way of doing this with a school that really makes a difference. If you'd like to know more, the place to go is to our website, look at joining ARC. Lots of virtual heads around the country, 40 currently, are working with over 500 members on projects of all sorts. So talking to your virtual head's a good idea. And we are really open to all sorts of schools and settings. We don't have a quality mark. We don't come and judge you. It's much more about recognising your aspirations and supporting you with them. And the nature of our support is outlined here, and I'm really sorry about the overlaps on the slide, but you can see it's about accessing a network of support, accessing resources, case studies, other people in similar schools, addressing the issues we've shared, getting some expert advice on commissioning training. Really, that's a big financial decision for a school or a virtual head to make. What kind of training should we be looking for once we've got it? We have a whole suite of online tools and research sources. So if you want to set up a project and you want to share within your school or across schools, you can do that. And there's also access to a whole range of conferences and events. So thank you very much for that. And we are now moving on to some... We're
giving you some contacts and links there. So if you want to get in touch with any of us, that's how to look at it. Just at the bottom, a small plug. This is what we've been doing at Bath Spa. There's some web pages which you might find helpful on there, but also there's some training materials that we put together for National College for Teaching and Leadership about 5 years ago. So they're slightly old in the tooth, but we think still valid. Those are there for you to access. And again, I won't bore you by going through it, but we have actually attached underneath some key references that you might like to look at as well. So.
Thank you, Tony and Richard. We have some questions that were prepared and sent in by our colleagues, and we're also opening this up to anybody online that wants to ask any further questions.
If I can just jump in there, just to remind you, and that those who joined us a bit later, because I know people have been joining all the way through, if you look at the bottom of the screen, you move your mouse around, you should find a blue speech bubble. If you click on that, on the right hand side of the screen, bottom right, you'll get the chat box up, and you can type in there the questions that you might have for Richard or Tony, or indeed from Michelle as well, about their presentation. So do fire away with any of the questions you might have.
Okay, thank you. So you talked about if a school is interested to be nominated for a Simpson Award, to talk to the virtual head. I'm just wondering if you could just give a kind of step-by-step process of what that might look like, and also whether there's a deadline and what types of projects you think would be that would fit really for the Simpson Award.
Well, as we've indicated, there's a huge number of ways that you can address the whole issue of attachment and trauma. And what we're interested in actually is what schools are doing to meet the needs of their particular contexts. So some schools have explored safe places. Some schools have looked at the impact of training the whole wider staff team. Some schools have worked with groups of parents who are themselves vulnerable and have made some real differences to those parents. So parents of a parent can parent the child. There are many and various. For us, the important thing actually, if you are that school or setting or that virtual head, is to begin the conversation and have a go at putting in an application. It's a fairly simple application process. We've tried to make it as open as possible. And I think the deadline for 2020 will be something like June. So you have got some time to think about it. If you've got the beginning of an idea and obviously you'd like to talk to us about it, please do get in touch.
And the other thing that we have noticed is that some schools are now acting in a sort of pyramid sense, where one school acts as a trainer for other schools. Again, trying to spread through a particular catchment area or community, so that children are getting a consistent experience through from early years, primary, secondary, and into some colleges as well.
Thank you. You spoke a bit about an audit tool for schools, and lots of us that work in schools are used to using audit tools for all sorts of things. I was just wondering, with this particular audit tool, who do the schools need to deliver that audit tool, and what's the capacity needed within a school? What kind of time does it take, and what does that look like?
That's helpful. We ourselves have looked at a lot of the audit tools that are out there, and one of the challenges is some of them are extremely impressive, very comprehensive, but you would really need to take your deputy head off timetable for a week to fill them in, and you may well produce a very, very big document, and at the end of that still not have a series of focuses for your development plan. Our tool's designed so that it could be done by an SLT in a couple of hours. So we've trialled that and sat down with the whole of the senior leadership team from some secondary schools, some primary schools, and talked it through with them. So it's designed to be a live exercise with that group of people, because we recognise that unless the school leadership are sighted on the challenge they're taking on board, the change won't happen. If we just give this job to one member of staff on their own, we're likely to overload that member of staff. So it's designed to be quick and easy for an SLT to do. And out of that, then, they are in control of what they commission, what they put into the development plan.
Thank you. We just had a question from Marianne, who's asking if you, by any chance, have any copies of secondary relational behaviour policies or examples of good practice. She's already aware and has the Brighton and Hove guidance, plus a few primary examples, but we'd be really interested further, particularly in secondary examples.
It's interesting, a number of people have raised this with us, and we are currently planning a workshop on this topic. My little word of warning is to pick up somebody else's behaviour management policy and almost do a copy and paste. May well put you into a slightly difficult position, because I think it's important for the SLT to think through the major change if you have been heavily reliant on rewards and sanctions to a relational approach. What we would advise is probably, and I'm going to say this again, talk to your virtual head, get your educational psychologist involved and actually discuss that and produce something that's bespoke to your school. But because we've had such interest, and as we're trying to respond to the needs of our membership, this is something we're working on at the moment, putting together a workshop for people who'd be interested.
Have a look as well on our website at the North Birmingham Academy, what they've been doing, and also Hope School, yes. Liverpool, their Ofsted. It's this year, April I think it was, although it's a special school, they have done some fantastic work, and that Ofsted, it's a 4-page Ofsted report. It's just worth its weight in gold.
Do you want to talk a little bit more about North Birmingham Academy and what was in there, why they were chosen for an ARC award this year? What really stood out for you in terms of their work?
I think the big thing for us with that particular school was that they'd done very much what we've been talking about. They'd not just done a sort of little tinkering around the edges. It's quite easy, for example, to set up and I'm not against inclusion rooms and support centres, but they had decided as a whole school to have a whole school approach. And if you think about that from the point of view of a young person walking through that school, encountering multiple teachers during the week, lots of different lessons, it means that whoever they encounter, they get that consistent, relationally based response. Richard talked earlier about using emotion coaching, and that child getting a high empathy, high guidance approach in each encounter. And that's very much the approach they've taken. And they were not content with that, because having done the work themselves, they then chose to share that with other partner schools. And where we really see big change happening, it's where schools are working together in partnerships. Nobody would be surprised that the transition between year 6 and year 7 is very difficult for young people. So where we're seeing secondaries working with their partner primaries, we're seeing big changes happen. And that was that, North Birmingham's willingness to take on that challenge and take that very bold whole school approach. It's a big investment, it's made big change.
The other example we have is from our early days of emotion coaching. Secondary school, the first secondary school we worked with, did 3 things. First of all, they took it upon themselves to train the entire staff. So we're talking about midday supervisors, TAs, everyone in that secondary school was trained in emotion coaching. Secondly, they focused on a group of year 7 boys who were on the edges of exclusion, and they worked very much with the families and with the parents to develop this consistent approach to emotion coaching. With some phenomenal results. They weren't little angels, but there was a huge reduction on in-class misbehaviour, but also a huge reduction in short-term exclusions for that particular group. And the third thing they did was they revised their entire policy on detention. So instead of detentions being punitive, sit down, shut up and just sit and get bored for half an hour, they were actually using the detentions to role play, look at restorative approaches. There's complete change of attitude in the school, and the Ofsted itself remarked on the way that relational changes in the school then led to better attainment when it came to GCSE.
Creates 2 very interesting graphs, this, doesn't it, where you will see an improvement in behaviour and a reduction in sanctions. And not everybody believes those 2 things should intersect in that kind of way. But in the middle of that is a teacher who is actually more confident, more capable, and more able to work through relationships rather than through following a very simplistic and dogmatic approach. You have a teacher then who feels empowered and capable, and we've seen with teachers their sense of confidence in their job has grown. Therefore, if we want a workforce that is enjoying the job and doesn't want to drop out after a couple of years, this is another useful spin-off.
I'd say very quickly, Tony, that doesn't mean you move away necessarily from sanctions, knowing or limiting behaviour, but it's a matter of doing it intelligently.
Yes. And
through relationships, not just through a rule book.
You mentioned right at the start of your presentation about how it could enable schools to get involved in research links to attachment. I was just wondering if you'd maybe clarify that a little bit more of how that might happen.
Well, we're delighted to be working quite closely with the Rees Simpson research, and I think we see this as having research from our point of view having sort of 2 dimensions to it. One is that the school itself becomes curious, becomes interested, both in understanding the causes of behaviour and how best to address them. And it begins to start looking at its own data and looking at shifts in its own data. And it is very interesting to see how many training projects have been rolled out in schools without any follow-up in terms of what's the difference that's been made since we had our big conference. But we realise also that not only might you be doing that in your school or in a group of schools, but it's really great to be part of something national. So where the Rees Centre research comes in is giving us a really powerful objective overview of the effects and beginning to link those things up. And as we've said several times, schools make a big investment to try and bring about change. Too often they're isolated in doing that, and therefore it doesn't become sustained. The overall research that we're part of and the research and are promoting is bringing schools together to share what's really working. And that's good for those schools, we believe.
And philosophically, we think this links into the new CPD approach, where schools do their own research. They don't just have a one-hit training, but schools do their own research to actually find out what's going on. And we felt that's endorsed by a lot of the discussions that have been at the Education Committee, in the report on retention of teachers,
Yes.
Hargreaves' report, etc., where this notion that schools take responsibility for their own learning is really fundamental to making the change.
Can I jump in with the question as well, which is, I was at the ARC conference a couple of weeks ago, and I was really moved by some of the presentations from the winning schools. And I wonder if you'd talk a little bit more about any of those that really stood out, or are there any things that bind your award winners together? Is there any sort of themes that you might draw on?
One of the things you may have picked up, and as I've said, you can see these PowerPoints and films on our website, is that in an awful lot of cases, the thing that you'll hear first is the voices of young people, and they themselves talking about how much happier they are, that when they come into school, there is somebody that they can go to, somebody that they can talk to, there's a safe place for them, so that they are realizing they're in a place where there are relationships. And for many of the young people we work with, and obviously my background is as a virtual head, that's unusual. And I remember starting my job, and a particular young man who began his career in a new secondary school, having really struggled before, the thing that overwhelmed him was when he came to that school, there was nowhere for him to go at the beginning of the day, no one for him to talk to. And if you look at those projects that won the award this year, young people are saying, there's somebody for me to talk to, I feel safe here, I feel known, I feel understood. And as Richard said, that doesn't mean, therefore, I feel condoned no matter what I do. In fact, some of these schools would be described as very strict, but they are both tough on behaviour and tough on themselves in understanding the causes of behaviour and doing something about it. They bring those things together, and that gives those children confidence. And it's those voices, I think, that probably most struck me as one of the people who looked at the wide range of applicants we had, young people themselves talking about the difference that it's made.
Staff understanding as well.
Yeah.
Staff being confident to understand.
And when you talk about the ARC giving advice and the ARC community, can you just give us a little bit of explanation of who is that?
Who is giving advice?
Who is the ARC? When you were saying about when in schools, when
Yes.
schools might sign up to the ARC, and then there's online resources, and then you were talking about you can get
Sure.
advice for certain policies or frameworks.
The ARC trustees are quite wide ranging. So you have academics, you have virtual heads, we have an educational psychologist, we've then got a group of expert advisors, a number of whom are serving heads. And we've done that deliberately because we want to make sure that our advice is current and based on practice. You asked a little bit about where's that advice coming from. The pathway that we've mentioned has been developed across work with hundreds of schools now. About 200 schools have used our audit, and we've talked to many of them about what's working and why. A particular piece of advice we've got, which is about commissioning training, grew out of questions from people who said, okay, I've got it, I've heard that inspirational speaker, I've been moved. And as Neil said, we had some very moving and powerful presentations at our conference. The end of that, you can leave people hanging. You can leave people with a sense of, okay, I really get it now. I have got children in my school who are not just naughty kids, but actually they have suffered a huge amount of trauma. What do I do? So the next question is, how do I get the training right? And there are lots and lots of trainers out there. In fact, there are an awful lot of very good trainers. I think too often those trainers are poorly commissioned by schools, or sometimes schools commission the wrong people. So what we try to do in that advice and guidance is to say, here is a commissioning framework that you might use based on the experience and the practice of all our members and our trustees. And that's how we try to work. We keep on spreading the net wider. We keep on picking up messages from our membership, and therefore flexing what we do and improving what we do, so we can give really strong current advice to people who are trying to get it right for their children.
one thing we know is that one-hit training doesn't work.
Yeah.
And there needs to be some sort of community support, whether it's a virtual community through the attachment research community, whether it's a community support through your virtual school network, or through your local pyramid, or through your multi-academy trust. It doesn't matter as long as that framework support is there.
I think the other thing we've very clearly noticed is that unless you support your school leaders and your champions in school, they will burn out. So we work very closely with educational psychologists to look at how we can provide proper supervision for heads and for people in pastoral roles in schools. And it's very, very striking that in schools, supervision is very, very unusual, whereas in social work or in mental health work, supervision is absolutely the norm. So these kinds of messages we picked up and we've incorporated them into our guidance and our sort of framework for schools.
Okay, thank you. We've got a question from Sarah about how has ARC's research and partner schools who have adopted trauma-informed practices impacted engagement, particularly with parents and carers?
It's as they say, it's a really useful question. I can think of our first award winner, which is now a couple of years ago, a primary school in Stoke-on-Trent. And what happened with them was that they began by doing old school training and took this on board. And that was driven, and they would say this, by the needs of a particular young person who completely floored them. And they realised that what was going on with this young girl was something they all needed to understand. But fairly quickly, having become an attachment and trauma aware school, they realised that unless they started to work with parents, the impact was undone every time that child went home. It's a bit like the rule of 167, which is that you have 168 hours in the week. 1 hour with a therapist is just not enough. So that school set up a parenting course with parents, and this wasn't a parenting course based on teaching parents behaviour modification techniques. This was a parenting course based on actually allowing, and this was a group of young mums, a chance to talk about their own parenting, their own experiences, and actually enable them to talk about some of these things for the very first time. That had a dramatic effect on their children, to the extent, in fact, that the pilot programme was set up on the basis of this, saved the entire cost of it set up in 1 year, because less children went into care from that school. And that was to do with the parents' confidence, the school's confidence, and that whole community working together.
And a school I've been working with, a small primary school, we started off attachment awareness, we did emotion coaching for the staff, and we actually had a request, could we do it for the parents? And that group of parents wants to stay together and do follow-up work. I think that's fantastic, you know, that we've been able to respond to that demand, really.
And we've got a colleague who works in a SEN department in a large secondary school. Her daughter's going to be attending a different school, and she's asking for some advice, really, on the most effective thing that she can say to the Senkos at each school to influence them to look at implementing that.
It depends on how you want to approach this, what can be quite a challenging conversation. And I can say this having worked with hundreds of schools at Virtual Head and having also been a senior leader in secondary schools. I think if you've got somebody who's curious, one of the questions to ask is, so where do you think this is coming from? Would it be interesting to find out? And you'll find an awful lot of teachers have not actually covered these issues in their training. And that's very sad, because I have sometimes said that the average car mechanic knows more about the workings of the internal combustion engine than the average teacher knows about the workings of the brain. And that leaves many teachers very disempowered. So you can go in from the curiosity angle. You can also go in from the NICE guideline angle. The NICE guidelines in 2015 said that everybody who's working with children who may have attachment issues ought to be trained. So that's a bit like saying that you have children with particular medical needs in your school and staff need to understand about them, for example. You know, a peanut allergy and having no member of staff trained in what to do with an EpiPen. And it's also interesting to look at the mental health and behaviour guidance. And I would really strongly recommend that people read that. It came out in 2018, and I think it was an acknowledgement from DFE that we need to balance that sort of whole school, high standards approach with understanding the needs of individuals. And it's very strong on making sure that your behaviour policy is actually legally acceptable. So where you have children with mental health needs that may amount to a disability, you need to make reasonable adjustments. There are lots of ways into that conversation. I mean, one of the things to recognise is that Senkos are under pressure. And if you go in there all guns blazing, what you will get is a fight, flight or freeze response, as you would with anybody. So probably the thing to do is to build a relationship first.
We've got a question from Marianne again, and she's asking, do you feel this is a journey and not a destination? So given the example of it's taking time and it doesn't end, and we are in it together for the long haul, and just kind of your comments on what she said.
Yes, I think.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is a journey. I mean, if you want to upset yourself, you can think about the fact that 90% of the connections that the human brain will make are made in the first 3 years. So where those connections are damaged through abuse, neglect, trauma, you have a child whose brain has some wiring that's been affected. Recovery from trauma takes a long time, and it takes a long time and an awful lot of consistency from an awful lot of people. Therefore, just as you have to be in it for the long haul as a parent or somebody who's working with people who've been traumatized, so ARC is in it for the long haul. And we try to be very honest with our members that it's not about winning a quality mark within 6 months and ticking 53 boxes. It's much more about that slow, careful, strategic change led by the SLT that will really make a difference. What's great to see is that works. There is such a thing as recovery from trauma, and there is such a thing as a school being able to take this on board and see really positive effects for the whole school community.
And there's also the idea that you just simply don't give up. Maggie Atkinson, when she was Children's Commissioner, was very strong on this. Don't give up. You've got to keep going on this. It's not an instant fix. It doesn't always work. Keep going, keep building that relationship, even though you might have the door slammed in your face one day.
That kind of leads us on to our next question, thinking about not giving up, and this is a journey, because Sarah's asking, are the approaches used in secondary and primary mainstream settings significantly different? And she's asking about, is it true that primary setting is more conducive to trauma-informed practice, and your thoughts on that?
Yes and no, isn't it, really? I think the conventional way that primary schools are configured as compared to the conventional way that secondary schools are configured, yes, I mean, I think it is easier in terms of the primary context, in terms of the size of the school, the potential for relationships. However, it is not impossible in the secondary situation, and that's really what our colleagues are saying. Colleagues who are secondary heads. James Wetz, for 10 years, has been pushing this from a secondary head perspective. It's not impossible, but you do need this change in mindset. We are not teaching subjects, we are teaching children.
And where that works, we mentioned earlier North Birmingham Academy, that, yes, it's a big investment for that school to ensure that all the staff understand this and all of the staff can work in a consistently high empathy, high guidance way, but it is doable. And I guess you could spin this and say, if you don't do it like that, both for the child, actually for that senior leadership team's point of view, you create an awful lot of fractured work with children. That means that children get a very mixed set of messages, which can exacerbate trauma. And it can mean that the SLT are picking up the negative effects of an inconsistent approach with children. Having worked in secondary schools and having had that unenviable task of being the deputy head with the walkie-talkie, walking from classroom to classroom, I would frequently pick up children whose behaviour had apparently become unacceptable, and the root cause was the behaviour of the member of staff. And I look back now and realise that actually one of the things we needed to do was ensure that there was consistency of understanding for those members of staff. That was essential. So it may be more difficult, but it's no more essential in a secondary than it is in a primary.
Okay. Which leads us to the next question, which is about, from your experience of being in the current education landscape, what do you think will be the tipping point before trauma-informed practice will become the norm in all educational settings? And Sarah's asking, is it about sharing ACE reports, building a critical mass and so on?
I think that we have actually passed the tipping point, because the NICE guideline in 2015 is very, very challenging. And I have spoken to a number of senior leaders about what the implications of that guideline. Just as if now you have a child with a peanut allergy in your school and you don't have anybody trained in the use of an EpiPen, you could face something very bad happening to a child. If you've got a child with unmet attachment needs and trauma, and you apply the wrong approach to that child, something very, very bad could happen to that child. And, you know, one does not want that to happen, but it's possible. And people always say that NICE guidelines are honoured in the default. When something goes wrong, somebody says, why didn't you follow this policy? There's that. There's also a tipping point in terms of seeing the change that happens when schools are getting it right. And there's a question you might ask of schools that are taking zero tolerance approaches, which is, one, is your approach legal? And that's why people need to read the mental health and behaviour guidance. But also, is it effective? Can we actually afford the level of permanent exclusion from schools, the amount of alternative provision that children are in because they can't cope with mainstream? Is that sustainable? So it's a bit like climate change. You know, this is actually happening now, and we need to address it now. And it is possible to do so.
So I'm conscious that time is moving forwards. I'm going to give people lurking in online a chance to ask a last set of questions, if there are any more to send through. And in order to give people time to think about a final question and to type it in, because I know it takes a little while to do so, I'm going to ask Michelle a question, which she was not expecting, which is, Michelle, in your role as the virtual head, you're working with a number of your schools around attachment trauma awareness. Why is it so important to you as a virtual head to do that? What's your motivation?
I think my motivation is I cannot bear unfairness and inequity with our children. And so I'm privileged that I go in lots of schools and I have lots of conversations with teachers, with designated teachers, with carers, with children, and every single conversation that I have about a child's future is inevitably linked to their traumatic early years or a traumatic experience that we're seeing. We might be seeing it in behaviour, or we might be seeing it in some other form, and I cannot bear that unfairness, and that is my role to advocate for these children so they can do the best they possibly can. And we have some wonderful practice within Oxfordshire, and we have schools that are really hungry to learn and curious to learn, and really trying to work within the tight resources that they have at times, to be able to meet the needs of every child and to really give them a good shot at a good education.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. That was a very good opportunity to give people the last chance to ask any questions. We've not had any other questions in, so at that point I'm going to draw an end to this webinar. We've been going for about 50 minutes now. Going to thank first of all Michelle for taking on the chairing role. Very, very grateful for you for doing that, and also to thank Tony and thank Richard as well for coming in and talking a little bit about ARC, about ARC's work, how that interacts with other things that are going on in this area, including the Simpson programme, but also sharing a little bit of the insight from the schools that that have applied for your awards and won your awards. And I think that to my mind is really very, very valuable. I would encourage everyone to have a look on the ARC website, have a look at some of those films and slideshows from the schools. As I say, I was at the conference a couple of weeks ago and watched some of those, and they're very, very moving. And particularly, I think, as Tony said, the voices of the young people talking about how they are feeling safe and how they're feeling secure and how they're now in a position to learn in a way which they previously weren't. So do have a look at the ARC website. If you're in a school setting, then do think about whether your school is one that might be applying for one of those awards again in the future. But we've had about 40 people on the webinar today, so thank you very much all 40 of you for dialing in, and we look forward to hopefully doing another webinar in the new year. We've got a number of different ideas. We may do something around relationship policies. We've also got ideas as well around what other virtual schools are doing, some of the ones that perhaps were trailblazers in this area. So we will notify people about what else we'll be doing, but the next webinar will be early in 2020. So thanks again, everyone, and I'll say goodbye.